Welcome to Vancouver Rape Relief's 2020 Montreal Massacre Memorial. I'm Laurel. I'm a collective member at Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter. This year we are hosting a series of 12 online events, and you can find the full program on our website at rapereliefshelter.bc.ca. We are live on Facebook as well as Zoom for today's event, which is titled Read.Think.Act, a conversation on the role of books in feminist activism. We're going to open up the conversation later on, so keep that in mind and feel free to type any questions in the chat on Zoom or in the comment section if you're watching live on Facebook. I'm really excited to be joined by a fantastic gang of women today. We have Elizabeth Pickett, Faye Blaney, Maria Paredes, Beck Wonders, and Charlene Sayo. And I'll just give a bit of introduction to today's subject, and then I'll turn it over to those women. The women of Rape Relief have long recognized the importance of feminist writing and access to it. Books expose us to perspectives, ideas, and experience outside of our own. We understand this as one way of learning and communicating, but far from the only. Every time we answer a crisis call or share with other women aspects of our lives in a consciousness raising group, we are learning, and our individual and collective analysis of male violence against women sharpens, as do our resistance strategies. One of the ways that Rape Relief members have cultivated women's access to feminist thinking is through keeping a library that includes published works with feminist and mainstream presses, as well as writing in journals and pamphlets. And you can see a bit of a glimpse of that behind me. I'm live from our library. The library contains writing on male violence against women, objectification of women, the manipulation of women's sexuality and women's health, imperialism and colonialism, capitalizing on women's labor, and charting the various waves of women's resistance. The library further categorizes materials into feminist and other, the latter of which may include work that is outright hostile to feminist aims. And this is because we know that in order to effectively strategize and fight back, we must be aware of and understand the misogynist ideology that's being circulated. The library is intended to emphasize resistance actions rather than disciplinary research, meaning that its very purpose is to equip activists in contributing to the feminist movement. And each generation of our collective continues the responsibility to add to our library of resistance. Not only do we keep a library, but we've also compiled a list of books that we ask women who join us as volunteers or as paid workers to read. The reading list contains writing under a number of subjects, including rape, wife battering, incest and childhood sexual assault, prostitution and pornography, racism, and women's resistance. By establishing a common list, we increase the shared understanding amongst us of how women's lives are shaped by the forces of male violence, racism, and capitalism. It's meant as an entry point from which to build on, and it's also available on our website. So let's get into the specifics. What books have been fundamental in shaping your understanding of of the feminist movement and guiding your activism, and why? I've asked each woman to prepare some comments, but I think that after each speaker, I'll invite other participants to comment in response if they wish to. So just wave your hand if you wish to speak and I'll call on you. And I'm going to ask Faye to start us off.
Sure. So before I begin speaking about the books that have inspired me, I want to remind us all that we, Indigenous peoples, have been denied access to literacy and education. The deal among settler governments on the public education of Indigenous children is a lucrative cash cow for the provinces. I say this because I was forced into a special needs classroom without any form of assessment while I was in residential school. Almost 20 years later, my daughter faced the same fate, and today the children of my community continue to receive leaving certificates instead of a dogwood at grade 12, and usually are still illiterate. So for me, I consider it an incredible gift to be able to read all the books that I want. For those Indigenous women and girls who may be watching this today, I urge you to resist the special needsing of our children. I urge you to pick up one of Eden Robinson's books or the new Carol Rose Golden Eagle book called The Narrows of Fear. This is where I started to read. I read Slash by Jeanette Armstrong, and I haven't looked back since. I read Half Breed by Maria Campbell. I currently have Helen Knott's book In My Own Moccasins, a memoir of resistance, and Morning Star Mercredy's Morning Star, a warrior spirit. I have a whole bunch more as well. I keep collecting them because I find them so inspiring. But the book that really had a profound impact on me was the Janet Silman book called Enough is Enough. Janet Silman is a Métis scholar, and she wrote about the enduring struggle of the Tobic women on the rights of Indigenous women. And when I was reading that book, it brought me to tears. These were tears of recognition, of realizing I was not alone and that change was possible. That book was my ticket to a life of fighting for the liberation of Indigenous women, fighting for freedom from patriarchy and misogyny, but also freedom from the dictatorship of settler colonialism and freedom from racism and poverty. Stillman's book created an eagerness to learn more, to understand more, to be an agent for change. I meticulously went through Kathleen Jameson's book, Indian Women and the Law in Canada, Citizens Minus. That led me to the other writings of women like Sharon McIver, Gail Stacey Moore, Teresa Nahaney, Emma LaRocque, many others. When I was in university, I also discovered Black feminist writers like Bell Hooks, and that really had an impact on me. But more recently, my whole world has revolved around the National Inquiry on the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls and the male violence that plague our lives. My goal has always been to bring more Indigenous women on board to learn these issues, to develop new insights and new understandings on these issues. That, in my mind, is the key to Indigenous women's agency in our own lives. Many already grasp concepts around colonialism and racism, but precious few have been exposed to feminism, to a conversation that centers women's interests. So that's my world. I mean, I really try to pass on what I learned from these readings to the women of the Aboriginal Women's Action Network and to any other Indigenous women's communities that I can reach. Thank you, Laurel.
Thank you, Faye. We'll go to Charlene next.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me a part of this panel. It's really exciting because
before we get to Charlene, I forgot to follow through with what I said I was going to do and invite any responses to what Faye had opened with, if there were any. Okay, well, if there's nothing now, then we have plenty of time later on if things pop up.
I'm excited to be here because We're discussing things that I really enjoy, which is books and also feminism. And when I was thinking about the books that inspired me, it's kind of funny when I go back in terms of when I was a child. I started reading when I was really, really young. My family moved around quite a bit. And I was actually quite shy as a child. I was very, very shy. So my father read a lot, and he still does. And so I think I was quite influenced by seeing him read all the time. And so I began reading when I was very young. And the books that I read that really had a profound impact on me were the books by Lucy Maud Montgomery. So the Anne of Green Gables books, everything by Judy Blume. I still have this copy of Just as Long as We're Together by Judy Blume. It's a bit dog-eared, but it was one of my favorites when I was a child. And then, of course, the Babysitter's Club's books. Those books are not exclusively feminist. Probably they don't talk too much about it, but I think it had a profound impact in terms of how I looked at books and the books that I was gravitating towards, because many of them centered on the relationships and friendships between girls and young women. And I'm glad that those were the books that I read as a young girl, because it really, I think it informed in terms of the kind of friendships and relationships I wanted. And I think I had a very idealized view on relationships with other women, but it became central to me, having strong female friendships. And as I got older, I was, of course, looking for books about Filipino women. Growing up in Canada as a child of immigrant parents, it's very, very hard to find books that reflect your reality and your community. So again, one of the books that I read, I was a young teenager, but it was the only one I had, was a book about Gabrielle Silang, and she's a Filipino heroine. But there wasn't a lot to really look for. It was very, very difficult. But I was always gravitating towards women and women of color because I wanted to find books that reflected my reality. When I was a teenager, a friend of mine was also frustrated because she said that she couldn't find any more, aside from this one book about Gabrielle Silang, we couldn't find any resources. We were looking for role models. And Gabrielle Silang is one of the only known woman heroes in the Philippines that fought against the Spaniards. So of course we wanted her as our hero, as our role model. And I remember just thinking at the time, I think I was about 18 or 19, that if I wanted to know more about her and any other Filipino heroines, I would have to actually go to the Philippines and do the research, because it just wasn't available, or at least we couldn't find anything. So that was always at the back of my head, this kind of research and this constantly looking everywhere for resources about women heroes that I could look up to. But then along the way, there was just something that I needed more answering to. But I think the one book that really, and I read a lot of books, and I still do, about women and feminism, but the one book that really pushed me to think more about women in the center of my life is really The Creation of Patriarchy by Gerda Lerner. I have to say that's still one of the most profound books. And I think it spoke to the time when, there was this man at the time that was sexually harassing me and my other coworkers. And I remember how I was behaving. I was angry. At the same time, I was a bit ashamed to kind of make trouble. I was reporting him. And even though in the back, in the margins, people were supporting me, on the outside, people were like, you're causing too much trouble. And I didn't understand. I was very confused. I was angry. I knew I was doing the right thing, but then again, I was also quite scared of my own actions. And when I finally started reading The Creation of Patriarchy, that book started to answer my own actions, my own psychology, and how patriarchy, even though I had considered myself to be a feminist since I was about 14, how deep patriarchal thinking had really been embedded in me, because I couldn't fully appreciate my actions to stand up against this guy who was harassing me and other women until I started to understand. But I just want to quote the one line here, not the one line, but one of the lines that was central to my thinking in The Creation of Patriarchy is when Gerda Lerner wrote, To be woman-centered means asking if women were central to this argument, how would it be defined? It means ignoring all evidence of women's marginality, because even where women appear to be marginal, this is the result of patriarchal intervention. Frequently, also, it is merely an appearance. So that really struck with me. And it was reading this book, and particularly going back to that line, made me politically conscious to actually just focus on women and women writers exclusively for years, which was also a bit of a scary decision to make. I thought, well, what if I was missing out on other writers and male writers? But then this book also said, well, men are everywhere. Like, they're just going to be everywhere anyway. So even if you just took a year, 2 years, 3 years, or however long, just to focus on women writers and women intellectuals and historians, that still wouldn't be enough, because you're always going to be bombarded. So this was really central to making a political and conscious switch to just read women for a while. I didn't know how long it was going to be, but I just wanted to center women. So I think it was almost about, I don't know how many years it was that I only read women writers exclusively. And it's only been recently, maybe the last year or so, where I was like, okay, I guess I can start reading male writers again. And I think that was just very important. It's very important. It strengthened my convictions. And it's not to say that I haven't stopped learning, but it helped to change my thinking. So this is the book that really grounded me, amongst other books, but it's also the book that I really recommend to women. And it's also a very hopeful book, because it's called The Creation of Patriarchy, which means that there is an end. And Gerda Lerner emphasizes that there is an end to this. So it's not just a book on how to think about women and centralizing women in the forefront, but also how to look forward and how to end patriarchy, because there is that end. So it's a hopeful book as well.
Yes, it's been on my list for some time. I just need this vacation for reading exclusively. And I'll make a serious dint in the list, I swear. Yeah, that's an important point, Charlene, that not only is there an end, but there was a beginning and a time before. Okay, Beck, was that you raising your hand?
Well, I just think you and me, Charlene, were very in sync, because I've just been rereading The Creation of Patriarchy. And what is better than one Gerda Lerner book, but two Gerda Lerner books? And I think one of the really interesting points that she makes is, asking, well, why? I mean, she uses the figure, I think, of 3,500, 3,500 years. I think you could make come up with a different number perhaps, but she asks, why have women been subjugated for that long? And one of the most interesting arguments I think she makes is the denial not only of women creating our own records, our own historical records, but the denial of access to those records. So that means that every new generation of women has to relearn from scratch what the previous generation already knew. And in that sense, I think books, it's so relevant to talk about, because what can bridge those ruptures is access to those records. So I agree that is absolutely one of the most important books, 100%.
Okay, Elizabeth?
Hi, yeah, I'll just add my admiration for The Creation of Patriarchy. For sure, central to my feminist consciousness, and just to reiterate what Beck said, and in some ways reflect on what Faye said in terms of the lack of access that so many women have experienced and still experience, how critical that is to knowing and understanding our history. And our history is something like women's history, women's movement history is something that we haven't had access to for very long. And sometimes these days, I feel like there is a lack of acknowledgement of how important that history is to our present activist activities. So in terms of the books that I chose, I struggled to choose only a couple, as I'm sure we all did. And I decided that that I had to choose The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, which is probably a problematic choice in all sorts of ways. It was written in 1962. I probably would have been reading it about 1969. And it's been roundly criticized for being incredibly narrow, not addressing issues of race and class. And those are justifiable criticisms. However, it was my first feminist book, and it had a huge impact on me. It was like an awakening to even see a book written about women's lives. And it's also interesting to kind of problematize that in terms of like, you know, it was narrow and restricted in terms of identifying issues around race and class, but it has been said that it addressed only middle class women. And I just kind of like found it interesting. I think how specific we have to be about those kinds of critiques, because I was not a middle class woman, and my family was not a middle class family, and yet it did describe rather well the sort of values and mores of my family and my mother's life. My mother got married in the post-war period, where there was this incredible drive for women to be at home. And it wasn't only privileged women in terms of class who were driven back into their homes. I think many women and families actually experienced poverty because of that sort of dictate that the best thing to do for families and for children and for men was for women to be at home. So women staying at home and confined and unacknowledged in terms of their labor isn't something that just happened to middle class women. And certainly in terms of, it's like, I can't even really begin to say the impact that that book had on me. And the only word I can really use is awakening. It's like, I just never thought about my own life as a woman, about the lives of the women in my family and the women that I knew, as having any necessarily important implications. So that's where it began with me, and it hasn't ended there. Another book I chose is called Still Ain't Satisfied, Canadian Feminism Today. I'm showing my age here for sure. It was written, Still Ain't Satisfied was written in 1982. And it was kind of a sort of look back at the previous 10 years. There was a first book called Women Unite, and it was also published by a feminist press, which is pretty interesting. I sort of hadn't thought about this book for a long time, but I think it's important because I do feel like it's really critical for all of us to look at our feminism in terms of our own context, cultural, socioeconomic, and national. So I do think that Canadian feminism was different from American feminism and even from UK feminism in terms of the issues that we looked at. And Still Ain't Satisfied covers a really broad range of issues, from the experience of immigrant women and the experience of Indigenous women, to women in the labor force, the issue of reproductive rights and abortion. But for me, in terms of its interest to me right now, and I've gone back and read a little bit, it begins to talk about the influence of the right wing sort of appropriation of women's issues and the threat from the right wing, and particularly it talks about the sort of rise of the Christian Heritage Foundation and evangelical Christianity and its impact on feminism. And it also talks about the dangers of one issue organizing. So choosing one particular issue, whichever it might be, and not having a politics that is broader and deeper than that, which I sometimes feel very much these days that we can run into that problem. So I was actually amazed that because I'd actually forgotten that these are not new issues, that we've been confronting these kinds of problems for a long time. So that and creation of patriarchy was my third. These were for sure things that made me think, helped me understand my own experience in a very patriarchal family and social context, and inflected my own activism, which up till then had been more anti-war kind of activation. It really changed my focus. So.
Yeah, to respond to your point, Elizabeth, and I think in relation to the creation of patriarchy and access to women's history, every time I spend a bit of time poking into some of the boxes behind me and looking through the materials, it's so clear that the issues and the forces are very, very similar to those that the women before me faced. The context has tweaked a bit, but at the end of the day, it's still running up against the same things. Okay, so we'll move on to Beck next.
Okie dokie. I am going to share my screen, so if you can just confirm that that works. It does? Okay. Right, so for today, I have selected a case study of a book by a feminist publisher. And I'm sort of taking a different route here because this book that I'm going to talk about is not just interesting because of its content, but because of the discursive space that it provides by the means of the publishing process itself, which was controlled entirely by women. This is important because these books can tell a story as discursive and as historical records of how certain ideas were developed, materialized, and distributed through woman-controlled printing infrastructure. In her 2004 study, Mixed Media, Simone Murray observes that the central tenet of radical feminist publishing is its conviction that women's entry into the sphere of cultural production involved the complete transformation of process as much as it did of product. Ritu Menon, who's the co-founder of Kali for Women Press, which I'm going to mention in a second, says that feminist publishing, almost without exception and everywhere in the world, came about as a consequence of the women's movement and in solidarity with it. Resistance was its raison d'etre. It was in ferment in the 70s and 80s, and it generated an enormous amount of material, the kind of pioneering work that forms part of the history of the movement and of feminism's politics. Now, the sheer volume of feminist presses during the 70s and 80s is almost difficult to believe. These are just some of the most well-known ones, but there were many hundreds more, often international in their reach. And so with that, with that in mind, I'd like to bring up this bridge called My Back, which is edited by Cherry Moraga and Gloria Anzaldúa as my main case study. Originally, it was published by the small lesbian press Persephone Press in 1981. Eventually, a credit crunch and a huge bill to the Internal Revenue Service for back taxes put Persephone out of business at the height of its success. This timing coincides with Barbara Smith and Audre Lorde, amongst others, founding Kitchen Table Women of Color Press, which then republished this bridge for its second edition in 1983 after regaining the rights from Persephone. In the front matter of the second edition, it states that when Persephone Press, a white women's press of Watertown, Massachusetts, and the original publishers of Bridge, ceased operation in spring of 1983, this book had already gone out of print. After many months of negotiations, the co-editors were finally able to retrieve control of their book, whereupon Kitchen Table Women of Color Press agreed to republish it. The following then is the second edition of this book called My Back, and produced entirely by women of color. In the original mission statement of Kitchen Table, they say that the founding of Kitchen Table Press was partially motivated by our need as third world women to have complete control over both the content and the production of our words, control which is usually not available even when working with feminists and alternative publishers. Now, there was a really lengthy ensuing discussion between the editors of whether to republish the book with a more mainstream press to access a wider audience, or whether that would diminish the politics and content of the anthology. And so this book really provides a lot of sort of information about what sort of decisions women were making, and it tells a story about a really complicated issue. Now, the book was published again by Third Woman Press in 2002, and one of the editors, Gloria Anzaldúa, also issued a follow-up anthology titled This Bridge We Call Home, with a more mainstream imprint of Routledge called Taylor and Francis, and in it, she included writings by men and white women. Now, I would love to go into the story more. Unfortunately, we don't have time at the moment, but my main point here is that tracing women's history through the material produced by women's presses offers us an intimate look at the formulation of radical editorial policies, compromises women had to make, intersectional strategies, interpersonal difference often, and the impossible impasse of sustaining a business while also trying to adhere to political ideas. Sound familiar? Exploring the feminist history of experiments in publishing allows us to understand how the publishing apparatus, that is, the material production of texts and the distribution of ideas, affects the way in which feminist theory is developed. Feminist books are not just static objects to consume, they are mechanisms through which the politics of the women's movement are created and enacted. Another example of a book published by Persephone is Woman, Church and State by Matilda Joslyn Gage, which was originally published in 1893 and then republished by Persephone nearly a century later in 1980. So in doing so, Persephone made a case for the ongoing relevancy of women's work of the past, which has a potential, aka Gerda Lerner, of bringing intergenerational ruptures to a close so that new waves of feminists don't have to relearn everything from scratch. Kitchen Table Press went on to publish numerous books until they ceased in 1995, including the 1983 Homegirls, a Black Feminist Anthology by Barbara Smith, as well as the republishing of the Combahee River Collective Statement, which was first published in 1977. Here are several other books, not all published by feminist presses, but they all tell important stories about the relationship between women publishing, language, and autonomous feminist discursive spaces and women's historical records. I'd also like to mention the 1-hour feature documentary about the Indian feminist press Kali for Women. I mentioned Ritu Menon earlier, titled The Books We Made, which you can watch for free on YouTube. The film outlines the evolution and growth of the women associated with the publishing house, founders and authors alike, and it's absolutely fascinating, and I really recommend watching that. And then for anyone interested in reading more second wave feminist books, I'm currently working on collecting titles and creating subject guides of feminist books between 1965 and 1999. So do head on over and take a look. And I am going to leave it there. And as I think my 5 minutes are up, so I'm looking forward to discuss further.
That's, I'm so glad you mentioned this bridge called My Back. We have, it's a favorite at Rape Relief as well. And we are going to do a draw for a copy of the book, but I'll announce how that will take place in a few minutes. Okay, well, let's move on to Maria.
Hello. If you see my dog passing by, she was so calm the whole time, and then as soon as you said Maria, she might start whining. So I'm sorry about that. Okay. So I just wanted to appreciate Rape Relief and Laurel for such a diverse panel. Once I heard the names, I was ecstatic, particularly because I haven't been able to see any of you women for a whole year. So I'm glad that I have you all present. And also I'm a bit saddened that Daisy's not here because I thought she would talk a lot about similar books that I have read. So I intentionally chose different ones. So I'm glad that Beck, you spoke about This Bitch Called My Back, because that was one of the ones that I wanted to talk about. So I'll just begin with talking a little bit about myself, because I think the choices in books throughout my years had a lot to do with who I am. Growing up, I was observing and listening to women and girls speak around me. A lot of you that know me know that I have a lot of aunts and I went to a women-only school. So I was very much women identified. I loved hearing all of the stories from all of the women around me, and I would just sit hours at home in the living room listening to my aunts. So basically I felt like I was a recording camera, just absorbing the rules and the habits about, how I can make it in the world. And I often told myself, as if I was just in a third person situation where I was just gravitating and grasping everything, but I didn't really understand who I was as a person, or I didn't have that self-awareness about myself. And I think because I did not have that ability to self-reflect, I found that my book selection then was a bit more creative and broader. So I picked a lot of fiction books. I did not grow up in in a family where my family didn't read. Most of the books that I had around me were from school. So they were picked for me. And I don't think my family and I spoke about reading or the importance of reading. I think also we were moving around a lot since I was very little. I migrated when I was 14 from Colombia and to the States, and then potentially after Canada. So the books kind of happened just randomly. They just naturally came to my hands, and I would just, if I ever had the opportunity to have them in my hands, I would just read. So some books that are problematic, I find, but were really essential for my life and my understanding about my place in the world, were readings by Gabrielle Garcia Marquez, like Memories of My Melancholy Horse. This was a story about a 90-year-old man who falls in love with a 14-year-old girl who was being prostituted. Perfume by Patrick Suskind, where a man who has a high sense of smell becomes a perfumer, and he's looking to find that perfect smell in the world, and he finds that virgin girls contain that perfect smell and decides to kill them. So from a very young age, I knew what women represented in the world, in men's views. I think looking back, those books affected me the most, and put kind of my feet on the ground. They made me, like I said, they made me aware of men's abuse and towards women. So as my teenage years approached, I was looking for someone to write about me. Books like Why Am I So Emotional became like one of very important books for me. That was a book by Eve Ensler. Absurda by Cielo Latini, which was it's an Argentinian woman's tale of her life with anorexia. And ever since I found feminism, which was in my early 20s, thanks to my curiosity in politics and learning it in school, also thanks to Rape Relief's famous reading list that you can find still on their website. Once I picked I think I picked Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. That book changed my life for sure. And yeah, as soon as I found that, I think I realized at that moment that I was in a historical context, that who I am matters based on all of the works that other women have done in the past, and that I'm no longer in a place of, gravitating and grasping all the information, that now that I have the information at my hands, I should take some action. So I chose to be part of the feminist movement at that moment on. So Andrea Dorkin, in a public appearance where she speaks about her process in which she decided to write her memoir called Heartbreak, she exclaims that history has taught us that those who have created inventions and given us freedoms and given us medicine have been the male doctors, the engineers, and the politicians. And these histories of great men have been kept in books and articles. Meanwhile, it has been keeping women out of that history. So she said, what we know is from men's words. And so Heartbreak was instrumental for me. I really loved that book and those words from her. I think we get our ideas from books, and I think also that we ourselves are reflected in those books. So in Heartbreak, some of the things that I took away on one of her chapters, she speaks about her relationship with books. She would immerse herself in an independent bookstore near her high school, where she would read philosophical, political, and revolutionary books. Of course, these books were confirmation that the world was indeed chaotic and painful and unequal. She also spoke about libraries in her memoir. She thought that librarians were the militia, that first defenders of keeping the underaged from books, controlling how many books to take and what books to keep in the shelves. This I find particularly true to what's happening with academia nowadays, deciding what we read and what to think about those readings, which me being a student, I'm finding more and more problematic. I am grateful for my school readings when I was young. There were books like Aventuras de un Niño en la Calle and Relatos de un Náufrago. There was Fahrenheit 450 and 1985 and A Brave New World. These books gave me an awareness of that chaotic, painful, and unequal world, or the potential, or the historical stories of that chaotic, painful, and unequal world. But I think it also gave me love for fairness and something better, like being capable of dreaming more than that. Another book that you said 3, so I'm not sure. You can tell me if I'm going. I mentioned way too many, so just let me know if I'm good with time. So second one is Open Veins of Latin America. I actually have it here. Everyone that I talk to, I always recommend this book. It's by Eduardo Galeano, and it talks about, as you know, Latin America's history has been filled with corruption, state violence, dictatorships, extortions, and kidnappings. But Latin America has also had a history filled with uprisings, revolutionary thinkers, and a continent where there has been a wide Marxist socialist uprisings. And so this book is that. It's as Isabel Allende, who is part of the forewords. She says that this book, it's a memory and it's the soul of Latin America. So if you're interested in learning more about what has happened historically in Latin America, in Mexico, and Dominican Republic, in Haiti, Brazil, Colombia, it will just give you a whole opportunity to get to know the uprisings and the violence and all of that. The third book, my last one, is Emma Goldman's in her Anarchism book. It really, every chapter that I read from this book, from Anarchism, it opened my eyes, and I don't think it was something new to me. I think it just solidified and gave me the knowledge, the language, when making my arguments to people. So the last Colombian elections, I had a big misunderstanding, or I don't think it was an argument with my family. They're pro right-wingers, have always been, Colombia has always been a very divided country. And the last Colombian election was in itself very divided, very similar to the States in that sense. So there is a chapter in Emma Goldman's book. It's chapter 3, The Psychology of Political Violence. And so she speaks about men who, she said men at the time, she would say men, but people tend to make assumptions about why people take guns, or why people decide to become violent when protesting or when demanding freedoms. And so she just asks the reader to question that. Why is it that why is it that there are people so desperate that will take guns and fight for what they believe would be a better outcome in society? And so, as you know, in Colombia, we have had many years of war. Colombia is very divided between the left and the right, and La Violencia was one of the most horrific historic cases of violence in my country. And so many people, if you said that you were from the left or from the right, you would get killed. So it was also the time when the guerrillas took guns. The FARC, which was a Marxist revolutionary group, who decided to take guns. Most of them, their membership was farmers, the poor, indigenous, and they just decided to go and hide in the forest and try to fight the government. And so I was very aware of this. I never really felt angry at them for taking guns. Obviously, as time went on, they decided to kidnap, and they decided to get resources through the drug trade, and they lost a lot of their political theories and way of thinking. But I always understood the reasons why they decided to take guns and hide. And so I decided to write a little note about it. And my family, they thought that I was pro killing and kidnapping. So I think Emma Goldman has given me that, like, more of the ability to explain myself and have the language that I needed I hope that makes sense. And I think that's it.
Thank you, Maria. So we're getting lots of requests for a compilation of all of these incredible books. So we're going to put something together on our Facebook, and it will be all the books that the women on the panel have read out as really important to their feminist development, but also the books that women in the comments are suggesting as well. So we'll put something together for everyone.
Can I make a quick comment about Emma Goldman?
Yes.
Because it's really interesting. There's the papers of Emma Goldman archive, and you can look at samples of her papers. And one of the striking things is that the state considered Emma Goldman a threat, not because what we typically think of, which is, you know, she was planning bombs or actions or dangerous things like that, but because she was integrated into the community and she was able to convey her ideas effectively. That's why she was considered a threat by the state. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind when we scheme.
Yes, important point, Beck. So I have a couple books that I wanted to share as well. And for me, as a relatively young woman who entered the feminist movement just a few years ago, books have been an incredible resource, offering me access to the huge body of work generated by the women before me. Those women took up the immense challenge of articulating the myriad of ways that patriarchy shapes, constrains, and impacts our lives. And also putting to paper their visions for liberation and the corresponding efforts that they undertook to get there. For myself, I've often gravitated towards anthologies. And I think this is because within a single book, there's a number of different women's thoughts and ideas that are situated in relationship to one another, be it challenging or agreeing with each other. And so I chose two anthologies that made a particular impact on me. One of which is called Yours in Struggle, 3 Feminist Perspectives on Anti-Semitism and Racism. And it's by Ellie Bilkin, Minnie Bruce Pratt, and Barbara Smith. So entering the movement at the time that I have, my experience is one of fragmentation. Generally, I've observed groups often isolated from one another, operating in silos, and particularly when it comes to rape relief, that they're positioned in opposition. And because of this, it's been difficult to even imagine genuine broad-based coalition work. So I found this book was helpful for me to grasp some of the politics at work in such scenarios. So I just wanted to select a couple highlights, some quotes from the book that I think are illustrative of it. So Barbara Smith says, "Feelings of affinity in themselves are not sufficient to bridge the culture, history, and political conditions that separate us. Only a conscious, usually politically motivated desire to work out differences at the same time acknowledging commonalities makes for more than superficial connections." And then on the next page, she goes to say, in quoting from Homegirls, which she was also a part of, and she's speaking particularly to inter-movement tensions between Jewish and Black women. She says, "I question whom it serves when we permit internal hostility to tear the movement we have built apart. Who benefits most? Undoubtedly, these outside forces that will go to any length to see us fail. And finally, on page 77, she says, our support for struggles that do not directly encompass our own situations cannot be motivated by an expectation of payback. Of course, we're likely to choose ongoing political allies on the basis of those groups and individuals who recognize and respect our humanity and issues. But the bottom line has got to be a fundamental opposition to oppression, period. Not a tit for tat of I'll support your issue if you support mine. In political struggles, there wouldn't be any your or my issues if we saw each form of oppression as integrally linked to others. So I think that gives you a bit of a sense of yours and struggle. And the other one that I think was it's a recent read, so I guess it's more so on my mind for that reason, but it's called Out of the Class Closet, Lesbians Speak, and it's edited by Julia Penelope. And it contains 34 different essays by lesbian feminist writers on how their lives were shaped and continue to be by their economic class position in society. In reading it, it really pressed me to reflect on my own upbringing and those in my community with new eyes and new understandings. But I think most importantly is that it became clear to me how obscure class in North America is for so many of us, and how we experience it individually, and that is intentional and by design. So I wanted to share a quote from Christos, his essay, who we have the delight of featuring on December 5th. Her essay is titled Headaches and Ruminations. She says, the purpose of keeping real life divided from the overclass is to keep us ignorant of and afraid of one another. As long as we see each other as the enemy, we can be seduced and manipulated by the corporations. Once we deny our need for a BMW, we can begin to define ourselves. So I think I'll leave it at that in terms of the books that I wanted to share with you. But I did want to kind of give us some space to respond to one another, and I'll go through the chat too and see what some of the comments are, and if there's any questions for the panelists. So did anyone want to jump in?
I was going to mention, I thought it was really interesting, Faye, that you brought up Half Breed by Maria Campbell, because wasn't the first edition, there was a section that was censored in which she describes rape by RCMP members. I don't know if you know more about that than me. I just rang a bell there. Oh, you're muted, Faye.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. I did hear about that, but I don't know a whole lot about it.
Yeah, I think it was recently that maybe it was reissued with the full manuscript where she describes that incident. But I think it's another example of the importance of having editorial control and control over, you know, what comes out, and being at the whim of sort of more mainstream publishers. So, and also, of course, it's a very harrowing book. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, I really appreciate, Beck, that you brought into the conversation the aspect of feminist publishing. And I mean, I think that's incredibly important for a number of reasons, and you outlined several of them. But when I see on my Facebook feed today, I saw that the cancellation of a publishing contract for a book that exposes the complicity and involvement of a Canadian mining company in human rights violations in Guatemala. And that when we're challenging patriarchy and corporate power, that there are so many who wish to have those truths stay in the shadows. And when we're looking to the big publishing companies to publish our perspectives and our truths, that these are the challenges that we're going to run up against. And having more feminist control over the process, at least can keep that a bit more under wraps.
Yeah, in all of the conversations that have been happening around the murdered and missing and male violence against women, there's been such a push to disregard the male violence coming from Indigenous men. And I'm remembering back in around, I guess it was 1989 or 1990, showing everyone how old I am. The Ontario Native Women's Association released their report. It was such, in my opinion, very groundbreaking report on the levels of violence that Indigenous women experience. And the chiefs, which is a male-dominated system, were objecting to the release of that report, and it came out anyway. And I think it gives us a glimpse of why it is that Indigenous women refuse to identify as feminist. And the one author that I haven't mentioned that's really had an impact on me is Dr. Joyce Green. And she brought together a round table and invited me and a few other women, and she talked about how difficult it is for us to identify as feminist, and the attacks coming from our own people saying that, you know, we're not traditional, that we're whitewashed, and they were accusing Jeanette Corbière-Laval and Yvonne Bedard of being whitewashed when they were challenging Section 12(1)B of the Indian Act. So it's been so challenging for Indigenous women to have a voice within our own communities. And I really liked what Elizabeth was saying about focusing. And that's what I've really tried hard to do in my activism over the years, to try and focus just on that, on Indigenous feminism, simply because it's so far away. It's in darkness. It's so far away from coming to light. Mm-hmm. And even with the national inquiry, it still hasn't fully come to light because there's just been so much pushback from the men in not wanting us to talk openly, in the fact that the inquiry itself was afraid to put forward the feminist concerns that women brought forward to the national inquiry. So anyway, I just wanted to speak to that.
Mm-hmm. Charlene?
If I may. Yeah, thank you, Faye, for sharing that. And I completely echo what you're saying in terms of just focusing on Indigenous women, because I absolutely feel the same way, being a Filipino Canadian. There's a question in the chat about publishing and mainstream publishing and how does that affect feminist politics. And from my experience, you know, it's really hard. It's very, very hard for marginalized communities to even get our stories out. And so I'm all for DIY and self-publishing and just finding creative means, because, you know, just as a couple of examples, my mother, along with other domestic workers in Vancouver, founded, it no longer exists, the Philippine Women's Center of BC, and also other chapters across Canada. We started self-publishing. That's why I became a feminist at a young age, because of my mother and other women other former domestic workers who decided to organize in the late 80s and early 90s. They started a newsletter as well. So they were documenting their own stories as what it was like to come to Canada. Why did they migrate? What were the conditions of working as a nanny? But also that work also tracked the history of domestic work from the perspective of the Filipino Canadian community. Throughout the years, of the PWC tried to get funding and was successful in terms of getting funding for some research and reporting. And one of the most important works that the PWC created and reported on was actually the situation of Filipino mail order brides and how that was actually connected to the rise of domestic work in Canada. When that was published, and I was one of the researchers and writers for that report, it was quite, a lot of academics were very interested, and they were really impressed in terms of the stories that we got from the women in our community. But when we tried to get more funding to further investigate like the long-term impacts of domestic work and how it created like this loose industry of Filipino mail order brides, a lot of funders said, well, you guys already wrote a report. There's like, why would you need to write another one? But we had other questions. Like we were looking in terms of the children of these women, of these mail order brides, what was going to be their reality, because now they were growing up. We were curious. We were curious in terms of how were the children. Some of these women had very abusive fathers, so we were wondering how were the young boys going to grow up, and how were the young girls who were biracial, how were they going to see themselves as women who were also mixed Asian and white? How did they fit into society then? There was so much to learn. But again, it was that whole idea of, well, you guys already wrote a story, that's it. You don't need to report anymore. As if that's all we have to share. And it made me, it still makes me angry, that response. I remember I was very young, but I remember that response because I thought, this is it? This is all we get? And so just in terms of mainstream publishing, a lot of times they don't want to hear these stories. They don't want to hear it. Yeah. And when I was younger, I was actually approached by an agent a publishing agent who was interested in hearing the stories of Filipino Canadians, but they really wanted stories of domestic workers and nannies. And I thought, okay, but you know, I'm connected to that, but I myself, that's not my experience. But they wanted that story because it was trending. And so, of course, it was something that also made me angry, that I thought, you know, they're also shaping the narrative of our community. I thought, I don't want to present with you just sob stories, because there are domestic workers and nannies have also gone on to be incredible organizers and feminists that have also participated in a lot of reports and have documented their own stories. And so for me, self-publishing or doing DIYs or doing something more creative where women can absolutely control the narrative instead of having other people shape it is extremely important. I'm not waiting for a publisher, you know, that to me, and I'm not waiting to be like, you know, people were always like wondering, like, do you want to be this big famous writer? I'm like, no, that is not in the forefront of my mind. For me, it's more important to really document the stories, because these stories will slip away, and it makes me sad to think about if these stories aren't documented, what's going to happen. And I just wanted to close off in terms of that. I always go back to this, there's this saying and I'm probably butchering it, but it's an African saying that says, when an elder dies, a whole library dies as well. And I always think about that, that, yeah, when an elder or when somebody in any community dies, the stories that they can impart and the knowledge that they can impart is gone. And so that's the importance of really documenting and recording these stories. And so most of the time, I just don't think that mainstream publishing is going to be interested, especially in the stories of marginalized women.
Yeah.
And all that. And I just think that as women and as feminists, it's absolutely our responsibility. It's not just like a need, but it's our responsibility to really record and to keep these stories alive.
Yeah, I really wanted to jump in here on some of the points that you've made. I think the one that just so infuriates me right now is this report that came out of the downtown east side called Red Women Rising. And, I thought we were past this day and age. In academia, when I was in university, we were talking about this, about whose story is this to tell and who has the agency or the control. And, in the 90s, when A1 was doing our research, we were using the very participatory approach, participatory action research approach to having the subjects, so-called research subjects, define the question and, define the solutions, very much like what we talk about around consciousness raising. And here we are with Red Woman Rising, and the author is the one that controls, and conveniently they put a Native woman as one of the authors. And, I wasn't a fly on the wall to see what that author, the Native woman, had to do with the final product. Knowing her myself, I'm quite sure that she didn't do much of the writing. And it's the non-Native woman that set the agenda, set the tone, got those voices, conveniently situated them in places that supported her own overall thesis. And, in the early 90s, at the time, or even the late 80s, when I was, my consciousness was being raised by women like Jeanette Armstrong. She called out Anne Cameron on her writings in books like Dream Speaker, where this woman was writing our stories and our legends, and she's not a Native woman. And at a feminist conference, they rose and called her out and said, these are stories that we can tell. We can tell these stories ourselves. And, that was in the 80s. And now here we are in 2020, and we have Red Woman Rising. And the tragedy of it is that the chiefs organizations are supporting this document. And I guess the piece that just eats me alive in there is the position on prostitution. And again, this is an area where Indigenous women's voices do not count. They never have counted in the area of prostitution. And this non-Native woman fully believes that prostitution should be legalized, that Indigenous women's bodies should be bought and sold. And how does that affect her? She's an ED of a mainstream organization, and no skin off her nose that our Indigenous women are being murdered, maimed, killed, whatever, and the chiefs, who are men, they have very little regard for the violence that Indigenous women experience because they don't know what it is. They don't know what it is to be an Indigenous woman.
Mm-hmm.
And there's others like that appropriate our voices. And so I'm very glad that Beck made the presentation that she did, that we need to be able to exercise some agency and control over what gets put out there. And, I'd like to shout from the rooftops that I do not support Red Women Rising whatsoever.
Yeah, thank you, Faye and Charlene, for your comments regarding who tells which community stories and to whose benefit. I think that's really important within the context of this conversation. There's a question from the chat back regarding the contemporary situation with publishing and how self-publishing and all of that fits into women's writing and women's voices.
Yeah, I really couldn't have said it better myself. You know what Charlene and Faye both brought up, and in line with the idea of self-publishing, there's some huge successes recently. So, for instance, Jessica Taylor's "Why Women Are Blamed for Everything." That is a self-published book, and you know, she's sold thousands of copies. Absolutely brilliant. However, self-publishing, you rely on the selling platform to be able to distribute your book, and on those platforms, books can often get banned. So it is not a perfect solution. However, you know, for women, I think it's a great option at the moment, but it doesn't quite replace what was there in the 70s and 80s, which was a women in print movement. It was a network. There were nodes all around the globe who contacted each other, who sent out lists. They bought each other's books. You know, there were women distributors, editors, reviewers. There was an entire infrastructure built around books that was controlled by women. And that we don't quite have today. And it also brings up the point about, you know, the role of a feminist editor, because I think every author needs a good editor. And I really recommend everyone look into Toni Morrison's history of editing and what she says about being an editor, because there's so many, you know, Black women who wrote and published work because of her, because she cared about the work and took the time to take it seriously. And we all need that mentor and support to take our work seriously. And one thing I'll say about the mainstream press, there's a quote by June Arnold, and June Arnold was in the Women in Print movement, and she was on the Women in Print conference, the famous conference, and she called the mainstream press the finishing press, because it is our movement they intend to finish. And I think you can apply that today as well. And one last sort of recommendation that I'm going to make, because of course today we can't just think about print, we have to think about digital platforms as well. You know, we shouldn't romanticize print too much, even though I think having printed objects is very important, because technology can often go out of date really quickly. Even if you have something stored on your hard drive, or if you have a subscription via Apple or something like that, you know, if as soon as one of those companies shuts down or your hard drive stops working, you lose that material. So I think it's always important to have print, because it really lasts the test of time. However, it's, you know, the way we interact and behave online, especially young women, we have to also think digitally. And there's a really interesting book called The Politicization of Mumsnet by Sarah Peterson, which just came out. And it's about why Mumsnet has been able to retain some sense of agency over their discussion, over the forums, how they've been able to actually disagree as well without women getting banned, and much more so than on Twitter, for example, where it's almost impossible to have a conversation, right? It's not designed to do that. So it's interesting to look at like digital alternatives. There's also Spinster, which is this kind of experiment of a feminist forum. And so all of that culminating into something that we could consider a networked movement of women creating their own records, our own records, and our own communication infrastructures will lead to some sense of autonomy. And because it's been done before, it can be done again.
Thanks, Beck. Yeah, and I think also we can't leave out the importance of supporting independent and local bookstores in this conversation. by asking these stores to get the titles that we want to read in, it means that it's more likely that other people, other women are gonna have access to those titles in these stores. And of course, obviously the exploitation at work in Amazon is well documented. And it's in our interest to support the local independent bookstores, but also the giants like Chapters, Indigo prioritize books from large publishing houses. And those are places that radical and feminist writing is unlikely to find a home in. So I think we need to keep that in mind too, of where we procure the books that we want to read. So I wanted to kind of offer if there was any final comments from the panelists. Otherwise, I'd love to share some of the books that have been contributed in the chat of recommendations. Okay. So thank you for a quite engaging chat. Obviously, I have so many books to share with you all. So there is Women in Socialism, Class, Race, and Capital by Sharon Smith, Women, Race, and Class by Angela Davis, Loving to Survive by Dee Graham, Beauty and Misogyny by Sheila Jeffries, The Beauty Myth by Naomi Wolf, Woman Hating, of course, by Andrea Dorkin, Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde, Helen Lewis, Difficult Women, A History of Feminism in 11 Fights, Eleanor Marx, A Life by Rachel Holmes, Adrienne Rich of Woman Born, which was one that I was going to put on my list, but I'm glad someone recommended it. And also Diving into the Wreck by her as well. Angels with Dirty Faces by Walida Amarisha, which exposes the harms from the prison system and the criminal justice system from a personal perspective. Sheila Ruth, Take Back the Night. Phyllis Chesler, Women in Madness. So as I said earlier, we're going to combine all of the recommendations from all of the panelists and everyone who participated today and make it available, because I think it gives us a lot of a diverse reading list that expands on the entry point reading list that I said Rape Relief makes available. So, oh yes, the draw. That was the other thing that I'm trying not to forget. So we have a copy of This Bridge Called My Back that we would love to put into someone's hands. So in order to enter, either send Rape Relief, the Facebook page, a direct message with your email address, or you can send an email to our email account, which is info, I-N-F-O, at rapereliefshelter.bc.ca. Okay, so thank you so much, women. I'm so glad to have seen your faces today and to have gotten to discuss such a subject that's so exciting to me with all of you. I do wish it was in person, but I'm thankful that we are able to do so online, given the situation that we're currently in. And thank you to everyone who joined us by Zoom or by Facebook and participated in that way. We're really grateful for that. The event will be made available on demand immediately on Facebook if you want to rewatch or share with anyone who wasn't able to get here. And speaking of the importance of women's writing, I am urging you to join us tomorrow for a talk called Two-Spirit Journey, a conversation with lesbian Ojibwa Cree elder Mani Shakabi, whose book I have right here. It will be at 2 p.m. Pacific time as well. And again, you can watch either on Facebook or on Zoom. And I'm told that just to repeat the entry requirements for the draw. So just send us an email, info@rapereliefshelter.bc.ca, or send us a message on Facebook with your email address. And I also do want to, in addition to tomorrow's talk, just let you know that we will be featuring 2 other conversations as part of this series with feminist poets and writers. So do mark your calendars. On Saturday, December 5th, we'll be hosting Christos. And on the following day, the December 6th, we have the honor of hosting Enina J again this year. So we'll see you then. Thank you so much.